This happened about 10 years ago when I was driving a route that took me through the remote parts of Nevada and California. I've been a trucker for most of my life, and while I've had my fair share of strange encounters, nothing ever quite matched this. I was hauling a load of electronics from Las Vegas to San Francisco. I left Vegas late in the evening to avoid the daytime heat. By midnight, I was deep into the desolate stretches of US Route 95. If you've ever driven through Nevada, you know how empty and eerie those roads can be. It's just miles and miles of nothing but scrubland, occasional cacti, and a sky full of stars. I was making good time when I saw the glow of what seemed like a gas station in the distance. It was strange because I'd driven this route a few times before and didn't remember any stops in that stretch. As I got closer, I saw an old, run-down gas station with a flickering neon sign that read, "Last Stop Gas." I figured I could use a stretch and maybe a coffee to keep me alert, so I decided to pull in. The place looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The windows were dusty, the paint was peeling, and there was an old payphone booth covered in graffiti. I didn't see any other vehicles or people around, but the lights were on inside the store. I walked in, and the doorbell jingled, echoing in the quiet night. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside. Shelves were half empty, stocked with expired snacks and dusty trinkets. I made my way to the counter, but there was no one there. I called out, "Hello?" but only got silence in return. After a minute, I shrugged it off, grabbed a soda from the fridge, and left a couple of bucks on the counter. As I turned to leave, I noticed a bulletin board near the entrance. It was covered with missing persons flyers. A chill ran down my spine when I saw how many there were, all from the surrounding areas and all within the past couple of years. I got back into my truck and continued my journey, trying to shake off the weird vibes. As I drove, I started feeling uneasy, like I was being watched. The road ahead was dark, and my headlights only pierced so far into the blackness. After about an hour, I saw headlights behind me. It was strange because I hadn't seen another vehicle since I left the gas station. The headlights kept getting closer and closer until they were almost blinding in my mirrors. I tried to wave them around me, but they stayed right on my tail. Annoyed and a bit freaked out, I sped up, but so did they. Then, without warning, the lights veered off the road and vanished into the desert. I couldn't see where they went. It was like they just disappeared. I was on edge now, constantly checking my mirrors, expecting those lights to reappear. But they didn't. I kept driving, and soon enough I crossed into California. My nerves started to settle as I got closer to civilization. I chalked up the weirdness to exhaustion and pushed on until I reached a truck stop just outside Bakersfield. After parking, I went inside to get some food and maybe catch a nap. While eating, I struck up a conversation with another trucker. I mentioned the strange gas station and the headlights that had followed me. The guy went pale and told me that the gas station I described burned down years ago, killing the owner inside. It had been abandoned ever since. He said there were stories about that stretch of road, about people disappearing and phantom vehicles. Some drivers refused to take that route at night. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd experienced was real. I finished my meal, got some rest, and completed my delivery without further incident. But even now, whenever I drive through Nevada, I can't help but think about that night. I always keep my eyes peeled for that old gas station, but I've never seen it again. It's like it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of a sleepless night and a sense of dread that still haunts me. It was a cold autumn night, and I was driving up Interstate 84 through Oregon. The sky was overcast, and the only light came from my truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. I was making good time, and I planned to stop at a rest area near Pendleton for a quick nap before pushing on. Around midnight, I was driving through the Blue Mountains when I saw a woman standing on the side of the road. She was wearing a thin dress, totally unsuitable for the cold weather, and she looked distressed. My first thought was to keep driving. I've always heard you should never pick up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of nowhere at night. But something about her seemed different. She looked genuinely scared and in need of help. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over a few yards ahead of her. She quickly ran to the passenger side and climbed in before I could even say anything. I asked her where she was headed, but she just mumbled something about needing to get away. She didn't have any belongings, not even a jacket, which was odd. As I drove, I tried to make conversation, but she barely responded. She just kept looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to follow us. After a few awkward minutes, she finally told me her name was Emily, and she'd been stranded after her car broke down. She didn't say much else, just that she needed to get to the next town. We rode in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of her shifting in her seat. Suddenly, I noticed another set of headlights in my mirrors. They were far behind, but it was strange because I hadn't seen another car for hours. As we drove on, the headlights kept getting closer, but no matter how fast I went, they matched my speed. Emily noticed too and started to panic, begging me to drive faster. I was officially freaked out but kept driving, hoping we'd reach a town soon. The headlights got so close that they were blinding, and then they swerved off the road, disappearing into the trees. I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. I decided to pull in, thinking we could figure out what to do next. When I parked, Emily jumped out of the truck and ran to the restroom. I followed, but by the time I got there, she was gone. I searched the whole rest area, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The rest area was completely deserted, and there were no other cars around. Confused and a bit scared, I went back to my truck and sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. After a few minutes, I decided to call it in. I reported what had happened to the local police, but they didn't find anything. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I got back on the road and continued my journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting those headlights to reappear, but they never did. A few days later, I found out that a woman matching Emily's description had gone missing in the area months before. Her car had been found abandoned, but she was never seen again. Some people say she was running from someone. Others think she met with foul play. I don't know what to believe, but I'll never forget that night, or the look of sheer terror in her eyes. Since then, I've been more cautious about who I pick up on the road. The open highway holds many mysteries, and not all of them can be explained. This happened about 5 years ago when I was running a route from Atlanta to Houston. I've driven that route countless times, but this trip was different. It was late summer, and I was making good time on Interstate 10. The weather was hot and sticky even at night. I remember it was around 2 a.m. when I started feeling really tired. I decided to pull over at a truck stop in a small town called Vinton, just across the Louisiana border. It was one of those places that looked like it had seen better days, but I figured it was good enough for a quick nap. I parked my rig in the back corner of the lot, away from the few other trucks that were there. The truck stop had a diner attached to it, so I went inside to grab a coffee before hitting the bunk. The place was almost empty, just a couple of locals and an old waitress who looked like she'd been working there for decades. I got my coffee and sat down, feeling the fatigue slowly slipping away. As I sat there, I noticed a man in a booth at the far end of the diner. He was staring at me with this intense, almost creepy look. He was scruffy, wearing old clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After finishing my coffee, I headed back to my truck. The lot was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of the freeway breaking the silence. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, something I always do as a precaution. I settled into the sleeper berth and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to that creepy guy in the diner. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a loud bang on my driver's side door. My heart was pounding as I sat up and looked out the window. Standing there, illuminated by the dim light of the truck stop, was the same man from the diner. He was banging on my door, yelling something I couldn't make out. I grabbed my phone and called 911, telling the operator what was happening. She said she'd send a patrol car, but it would take a few minutes. Meanwhile, the guy kept banging on the door, trying to get in. I reached under my seat for the tire iron I kept there and held it tightly, ready to defend myself if he managed to break the window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling into the lot. The man saw it too and took off, running into the darkness. The officers arrived and took my statement, but they couldn't find him. They suggested I move on to a different truck stop, just to be safe. I didn't need any more convincing. I drove another hour down the road to a more populated rest area, my nerves on edge the whole way. I barely slept that night, every noise making me jump. The next morning I heard from another trucker that there had been several incidents in the area recently, with reports of a man harassing drivers at night. I never saw that guy again, but every time I pass through Louisiana I think about that night. It's a reminder to always stay vigilant and trust your instincts. The road can be a dangerous place, not just because of the miles you travel, but because of the people you might meet along the way. Stay safe out there, friends, and always keep your doors locked. It was winter, and the weather was brutal. Snowstorm warnings were all over the radio, but I had a deadline to meet, so I pushed on. I was cruising along Interstate 80, somewhere near Rawlins, Wyoming. If you know that stretch, you know it's barren, just miles of nothing but snow and the occasional truck stop. The snow was coming down hard, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I decided to pull into a rest area I spotted ahead. It was one of those small ones, just a few parking spots, and a basic shelter with a bathroom. I parked my rig and went inside to warm up and wait out the worst of the storm. The place was empty, which wasn't surprising given the weather. I sat down on one of the benches and pulled out my thermos, pouring myself a cup of coffee. As I sipped, I noticed a strange smell in the air, like something rotten. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the old building. After about an hour, I was feeling restless. The storm wasn't letting up, but I needed to get moving. Just as I was about to head back to my truck, the door creaked open and a man stumbled in. He was covered in snow, shivering violently. His clothes were torn, and he looked like he'd been out in the storm for a while. I asked if he was okay, but he just mumbled something I couldn't understand. I offered him some coffee, and he nodded, still shivering. As he warmed up, he started to talk more clearly. He said his name was Tom, and that his car had broken down a few miles back. He'd been walking through the storm, hoping to find help. I told him he could ride with me to the next town, and he seemed grateful. We headed out to my truck, the snow crunching under our boots. Once inside, I cranked up the heat and got back on the highway. The storm was still raging, but at least we were moving. Tom was quiet at first, staring out the window. After a while, he started to open up. He mentioned he was on his way to visit family in Cheyenne but got lost in the storm. As he talked, I noticed something odd. His clothes were old, like really old-fashioned, and his speech had a strange, almost outdated rhythm to it. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured he was a bit eccentric. We drove for another hour and the storm finally started to let up. The sky was clearing, and I could see the outline of the mountains ahead. I told Tom we were getting close to a town where he could get some proper help. That's when things got weird. Tom started to get agitated, saying he couldn't go into town, that he needed to be dropped off before we got there. I tried to reassure him, but he kept insisting. Finally, I pulled over at a rest area just outside of Laramie, figuring he could call someone from there. He thanked me and got out of the truck. As he walked away, I felt this strange sense of unease, like something wasn't right. I watched him disappear into the shadows, then got back on the road. I radioed ahead to let the rest area attendants know there was a guy who might need help. I made it to Denver without any more issues, but the whole encounter stuck with me. A few weeks later, I was back on that route and decided to stop at the same rest area. I asked the attendant if they'd seen Tom, describing him in detail. The attendant looked at me with a puzzled expression and said that I'm the third trucker to ask about that guy. Thing is, no one ever saw him here, and the cameras didn't pick up anyone matching his description. Turns out there's an old local legend about a man who froze to death near that stretch of highway back in the 1920s. Folks say his spirit wanders the road, trying to find his way home. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and it still freaks me out. Back in 2016, I was driving a long haul from Chicago to Los Angeles, taking I-55 most of the way down. It was late spring, and the weather was perfect for driving, clear skies and mild temperatures. I'd been on the road for a good 12 hours when I decided to take a break at a rest stop near St. Louis. The rest stop was pretty standard, just a parking lot with some picnic tables, vending machines, and a small building with bathrooms. There were a few other trucks there, but it was quiet. I parked my rig and got out to stretch my legs. After a quick walk around, I decided to grab a snack from the vending machine and head back to my truck. As I was making my way back, I noticed an old beat-up van parked near the edge of the lot. There was something off about it. It looked like it hadn't been driven in years, covered in dirt and grime with flat tires and broken windows. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked by, I got this weird feeling like I was being watched. I shrugged it off and climbed back into my cab. Locking the doors behind me, I settled into the sleeper berth and closed my eyes, hoping to catch a quick nap before hitting the road again. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like someone or something was brushing against the side of my truck. I sat up and listened, my heart starting to race. The scratching continued, getting louder and more insistent. I peeked out the window but couldn't see anything. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe it was an animal or some prankster messing with me. I decided to check it out, grabbing my flashlight and stepping cautiously out of the truck. The lot was eerily quiet, and the scratching sound had stopped. I walked around my truck, shining the light along the sides, but there was nothing there. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed movement near the old van. The flashlight beam caught a figure crouching by the van's side, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, with wild hair and clothes that looked like they were falling apart. He was scratching at the van's door, muttering to himself. I called out to him asking if he was okay, but he didn't respond. He just kept scratching and muttering like he was in some kind of trance. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. And that's when he turned to face me. His eyes were wide and vacant, like he was staring right through me. His face was gaunt, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He started to stand up, and I realized just how tall and lanky he was, almost unnaturally so. I backed away, my heart pounding. Something about him was deeply unsettling, like he didn't belong in this world. He took a step toward me, still muttering. And I decided I'd seen enough. I turned and bolted back to my truck, locking the doors and fumbling for my keys. As I started the engine, I glanced back and saw him standing there, just watching me with those empty eyes. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I pulled out of the rest stop and got back on the highway, not stopping until I reached the next town. I found a well-lit truck stop and parked among other trucks, finally feeling a bit safer. Later, I heard stories from other truckers about that rest stop. They said it had been abandoned for years and that the van had been there even longer. Some claimed it was haunted, others said it was just a place where drifters and lost souls ended up. Whatever the case, I've never stopped there again, and I advise anyone driving that route to keep going no matter how tired you are. The road has a way of showing you things you'd rather not see, and sometimes it's best to keep moving. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.